Hello, Richard Westwood here from St Anne's Church. We're looking at some more content from the first letter of the Apostle John. And in this week's study, we're going to be looking at 1 John chapter 5, the final chapter of John's first letter. I'm going to read 1 John chapter 5 for us in a moment or two, and then I'll offer some thoughts which I hope will help us to understand some of the content which he's offering to us. After that, we've got chance for a group discussion on Zoom on Tuesday evening at 7:30. That's Tuesday, the 9th of February, and the invitation is on the church website. If you'd like to join in, please do. You'll find on the church website the details for the discussion questions that you're invited to think through. So 1 John chapter 5. Faith in the incarnate Son of God. Everyone who believes that Jesus is the Christ is born of God, and everyone who loves the Father loves his child as well. This is how we know that we love the children of God, by loving God and carrying out his commands. In fact, this is love for God, to keep his commands. And his commands are not burdensome. For everyone born of God overcomes the world. This is the victory that has overcome the world, even our faith. Who is it that overcomes the world? Only the one who believes that Jesus is the Son of God. This is the one who came by water and blood, Jesus Christ. He did not come by water only, but by water and blood. And it is the Spirit who testifies, because the Spirit is the truth. For there are three that testify: the Spirit, the water, and the blood, and the three are in agreement. We accept human testimony, but God's testimony is greater, because it is the testimony of God, which he has given about his Son. Whoever believes in the Son of God accepts this testimony. Whoever does not believe God has made him out to be a liar, because they have not believed the testimony God has given about his Son. And this is the testimony: God has given us eternal life, and this life is in his Son. Whoever has the Son has life. Whoever does not have the Son does not have life. I write these things to you who believe in the name of the Son of God, so that you may know you have eternal life. This is the confidence we have in approaching God, that if we ask anything according to his will, he hears us. And if we know that he hears us, whatever we ask, we know that we have what we asked of him. If you see any brother or sister commit a sin that does not lead to death, you should pray, and God will give them life. I refer to those whose sin does not lead to death. There is a sin that leads to death. I am not saying that you should pray about that. All wrongdoing is sin, and there is a sin that does not lead to death. We know that anyone born of God does not continue to sin. The one who was born of God keeps them safe, and the evil one cannot harm them. We know that we are children of God, and that the whole world is under the control of the evil one. We know also that the Son of God has come and has given us understanding, so that we may know him who is true. And we are in him who is true, by being in his Son Jesus Christ. He is the true God and eternal life. Dear children, keep yourself from idols. Earlier on in his letter, in chapters 2, 3 and 4, John has been stressing the importance of love, belief and obedience, a sort of threefold test as to whether we're a true part of God's family. And in 1 John chapter 5, he brings all of these three things together. In verses 1 to 5, He talks about how love of God will show itself by love of our brothers and sisters who are also Christians. And it's important to stress out here that it's not by loving one another that leads us to become God's children. The phrase he uses, being born of God. It's more that those who have been born of God will go on believing that Jesus is the Christ. That it's the believing is the evidence of the son and daughtership which we've been given through Jesus. The two go together. And in the same way, love of God and love of brother and sister go together also. The love of God will show itself through obedience to God. And in these verses 1, 2, 3, 4 and 5, John is kind of interweaving the notions of faith in God through Jesus, love of one another within the church, and obedience, keeping God's commands, as though these three things mesh together. An illustration might be to think about a milking stool or a tripod with three legs. And each of the three legs are important if we're to have a stable journey and travel well with God. And it's worth thinking about, well, which of those three, the love of brothers and sisters in the church, the faith in Jesus, and the obedience to God's commands, which of those three things are the ones that I am doing okay with and ones that I think I'm struggling with? The phrases that John uses in this early part of chapter 5 are interesting because they're not translated that well in many of the language of the Bibles written in English, because it's really about how being born of God is translated. It's saying that phrase, being born of God, suggests that it is something that has happened. But actually the tense that's used in the Greek that John uses is to say it's going on being born of God, a continuous process. In other words, those who are going on with their being born of God will go on believing that Jesus is the Christ. It's a moving process. It's not saying back in the day when I was born of God, that's when this happened. John's talking about a continuous present event that happened and is continuing to happen. So I suppose John's thinking there about how we may have decided to follow Jesus at some point in the past, and also that is being underlined in the way that we're living out our life of faith, our obedience, and our love as our brothers, love of brothers and sisters too. In verses 6 to 10 of chapter 5, John once again reaffirms how Jesus came in physical form, and that this is the testimony that can be trusted. He talks about the blood and the water, and the people who have spent many years studying these books, these phrases are undecided as to really what that might mean. Some of the best ones I've come across seem to talk about how when John witnessed the death of Jesus, we're told that, and he records this in his gospel, that when the soldier pierced Jesus' side, the blood and water flowed from his side. John's therefore saying that Jesus really was a physical human being who died. Again, squashing this idea that Jesus really wasn't. He just appeared to be a human and so forth. So that could be part of what's going on there. But in these verses 6 to 10, John's underlining the arguments he's been making earlier on in his writing, that actually the heresies he's been writing against, the idea that spirit's good, material's bad, so Jesus only appeared to be a human, he's squashing all that. John's clear that Jesus is God, living as a human being, God in human form. In verses 11 and 12, John stresses that eternal life that God gives to us through Jesus. And that if we don't have that relationship with God through Jesus, then we don't have this eternal life. It's important to think about here what John's meaning by the use of the phrase eternal life. And other times that he uses it, and it's used a number of times in 1 John 5 here, but also in John chapter 17, verse 3, John's Gospel chapter 17, where he says this, "Now this is eternal life, that they may know you, the only true God, and Jesus Christ, whom you have sent." Now this is eternal life, knowing God, he's saying. and Jesus Christ, whom you've sent. So for John, eternal life is not just life after we die with God. In John's understanding, eternal life is quality as well as quantity, a depth of life, if you like, as well as the length of it. And I wonder if that might change our understanding of these verses in John's letters when he's talking about eternal life. We need to get out of our heads the idea that when John says eternal life, he's just meaning life in heaven with God after we die. I think he's talking about the life of God's kingdom now and going on beyond death. And so that quality and depth and substance of life that we have as a result of a relationship with God through Jesus. So that's, I think, part of the key to understanding those phrases in verses 11 and 12 of 1 John 5. In verses 13 to 15, John talks about assurance. He coming to the end of his writing, and he says the reason he's writing is so that people may know they have eternal life. Again, that phrase once more, life with Jesus now and forever. He wants people to have assurance that they are loved by God, accepted, and really are God's children. In verse 15, he appears to say that God gives us what we ask for. But I don't think it can be as simple as that. Most of us would say that that's not been our experience. So we may need to think about what John might be meaning. And it might be helpful to think about John's Gospel, chapter 14, verses 13 to 14, where he records Jesus' words, where Jesus says, "And I will do anything you ask in my name, so that the Father may be glorified in the Son. You may ask me for anything in my name, and I will do it." I wonder whether John has a particular kind of prayer in mind here, rather than some sort of shopping list. You know, the sort of prayers where we have a deep sense that God is calling us to pray a prayer about something, about his kingdom, rather than just this wish list. And it also doesn't say when God will grant us that request. Sometimes we get caught up with the timing of the prayers, don't we? I wonder whether we need to just accept that sometimes God has answered our prayers, but it's not in the time frame that we were expecting. In verses 16 to 18, John talks about support for others, and in the context of other people around us who we think are involved in doing things that we and others perhaps know to be wrong. And he says the first job we should have is to pray for them before we attempt any help or correct or challenge of them. I guess we might want to ask as well what sins that lead to death means. I wonder whether it's continuing to sin. In other words, going deliberately and continuing to go deliberately on a path that we know to be wrong and continuing to do it. Carrying on in a path that leads to death, this separation from God. But we also need to read that alongside what John says in 1 John 1 verse 9, that if we confess, God is faithful and will forgive us. Of course, he might be talking about deliberately turning against Christ, sort of heresy, of people who've at one point been a follower of Jesus and then renouncing that faith in some way. And that would tie in perhaps with some of the other letters. Hebrews chapter 6 verse 4 to 6 will be one that's an instance there. That's a phrase that you might call apostasy. It might be a good fit, really, given some of the other things that John's been talking about earlier in the letter. In verse 18, he talks about continuing to sin. And again, this phrase, those who are born of God will not continue to sin. It's this continuous phrase, a phrase in the English language that we don't have, a tense that we don't have. So that born of God there in verse 18 should really be those going on being born of God. It's a continuous present tense. So it means those being born of God do not continue to sin. In other words, if we're travelling the road of being a Christian disciple, it's not possible for us to then say yes to Jesus in the way that we want to live as a disciple, and also carry on deliberately continuing to do something that we know is wrong. That doesn't mean to say that we don't trip up or make mistakes. It just means that those two things can't you can't travel in two different directions at the same time, really. John finishes his letter by encouraging his readers to go on believing and trusting in Jesus, persevering and avoiding idolatry. In other words, giving worship to anything other than God. That's a whistle-stop tour through some quite complicated verses in 1 John chapter 5. And I hope that it'll give us some what I've just mentioned just now will give us some starting points for the discussion questions, which you'll find on the website. And I hope to see you in our discussion on Zoom on Tuesday the 9th of February. Thanks for watching.